Stanford University.
It's really great to be back at Stanford. I hardly recognize it. There's so much new building on this side of campus since I was here. As mentioned, I lead a fairly large institute at Berkeley. It's now 500 people altogether, 130, including 130 professors, and all the rest are graduate students and postdocs. And it's funded largely by a $500 million commitment from BP, a 10-year commitment. And it's not a biofuels institute. Actually, the mandate is shown here. It's to explore the application of modern biology to the energy sector. But we started off, when we started off, I had participated in writing a document inside DOE called Breaking the Barriers to Cellulosic Fuels. And so that became, therefore, kind of the roadmap for a fairly large activity. But we also, I should say, have some activities in what I would call petroleum microbiology, such as, for example, souring of wells and corrosion and things that are also caused by biological processes. But today I'm just going to talk about our cellulosic fuels aspects. And obviously the core idea is that photons reduce carbon dioxide to produce biomass, and when you burn it, you produce work, and the CO2 cycles around to some extent, and the degree to which it cycles around is a function of how much CO2 offsetting emissions are caused by the tilling of the soil, the conversion of acres to farmland, the production of fertilizer, that uses about 2% of energy worldwide, and then the transportation and processing at least. And so as to whether it's actually carbon neutral or carbon positive, it very much depends on exactly how you do it. So this is a matter where the details really matter. And so some types, as we know, where it's widely, let's put it this way, my colleagues at Berkeley believe that, for example, corn ethanol, when you take all these things into account, is only about 20% better than gasoline. Some people say it's worse, depending on which model you use. And so there's a huge industry now of life cycle analysis that tries to account for all aspects of the process. Let's call it in this version, biomass production, transportation, refining, product transportation and combustion, and you can see or a summary of the kinds of factors that go into such a life cycle model. The problem in the particular case of cellulosic fuels is that we don't have we don't have a significant large-scale operation running, so the models are all still pretty hypothetical, and as I'm going to show you, subject to a lot of uncertainty. In fact, I believe, and I think our research indicates that we don't really even know how it's going to be done yet, even though there are some companies trying to build facilities. There's a certain incentive for being early in the field. So I like this slide, and I doubt that it's true in any extent at all, but the reason I like it is that it conveys something else, which in the field, there is a fair amount of support from various environmental communities for cellulosic fuels. You can see over here, this is a measure of emissions relative to gasoline. And you can see here in this particular slide from the Union of Concerned Scientists, California Air Resources Board and EPA assess most types of corn ethanol production as worse than gasoline. But by the same sort of criteria, cellulosics over here, in some manifestations, they call it EPA 2022, is assuming some technical innovation, are actually not only zero emissions, they're negative emissions because of carbon sequestration and things like that. As I said, I don't think it's true, but I wanted to convey that unlike corn ethanol, which has got a very, which is these days no longer, popular with the environmental community, so far cellulosic fuels still have some cachet. I'm not going to talk about corn ethanol. I just wanted to show you the run-up in it if you haven't seen it. So this is the run-up in production starting back in 1980. It uses about 3%, I guess, of corn grain supply, global corn grain supply. So it's actually, although it produces 10% of U.S. gasoline now, it has some impact on food, but not as big as usually claimed by the critics, I would say. And it's probably going to stop at this point because we use about 140 billion gallons of gasoline in the United States, and we're currently, this year, we're probably blending it already at 10%. And that's pretty much what the fleet can withstand. So corn ethanol is probably finished, I think, largely. Although one sees the EPA trying to approve certain types of vehicles for up to 15% ethanol so that the corn industry can push a bit more corn ethanol into the market. Now, the really big, I think corn, as I said, is going to top out. But by contrast, sugarcane-based ethanol is just really beginning its expansion. So in Brazil, you probably know that you can't buy gasoline. You can only buy a mixture of 25% gasoline and 75% ethanol or 100% ethanol. And they currently get 40% of all light-duty transportation fuel from sugarcane. And they get that on only 4.5 million hectares. And so there's about 4 million hectares are used for sugar, 4.5 million for fuel. And to put that in perspective, there's, by our estimate, 230 million hectares of cattle ranching in the area where the land could be devoted to sugarcane. So sugarcane for fuel is actually a tiny proportion. It's 0.7% of their agricultural land. So the Brazilian government has passed legislation that will allow sugarcane to expand to 64 million hectares. And so we believe that, well, that's more than, assuming some energy or efficiency improvements, that would be between a 10 and 20%, no, not percent, fold improvement or increase in Brazilian ethanol production during the next 30 years or so. So Brazil is going to be the giant. By itself, our calculations are Brazil could probably, on those 65 or 64 million hectares, produce about 14% of all the gasoline demand in the world when they get there. I'll come back to Brazil. It's a place where, what I'm going to talk about, there is also a big cellulosic opportunity there. I'd also point out that actually the cane is very far away from the forest. That cane is not what's causing deforestation at present. It's a cattle problem. Okay, now in the context of cellulosic fuels, the kickoff study, you might say, in this country at least, was this somewhat out-of-date study now called the Billion-Ton Vision, published by some USDA and DOE scientists in 2005. And basically what they did was they went county by county around the United States looking at land use. And for example, they looked at the 90 million acres of corn we have and assumed that we could take half of the cobs and stalks, the so-called stover, and leave the other half on the field for erosion control. And that turned out at perfection, you could convert that to about 26 billion gallons of ethanol. And then they looked at that time, 40 million acres of land that we pay farmers not to farm and assumed we could grow perennial grasses on that. And that would be another 45 billion gallons. That's, by the way, has subsequently shrunk to 32 million acres. So it's a useful thing to bear in mind. If people tell you we're running out of land, you need to remember we pay farmers not to farm very large amounts of land in order to provide price supports for the major commodities. And so on. And they went around and they looked at, as you can see, the wheat straw and the other crop residues and so on. And when they totaled it all up, it came to 1.3 billion dry tons a year of biomass that was excess to all other uses. And they largely ignored the fact that we have 750 million acres of trees in the United States. So 90 million acres of corn, 750 million of trees. Much of the trees are actually stranded because we more or less lost the pulp and paper industry in this country. 85 pulp mills closed in the last 15 years or so. And all the wood that was going to be used for pulp has no particular use. So I think that this actually is an underestimate of how much biomass is really available. And by the way, a ton of biomass typically converts to around 110 gallons of ethanol if you could convert all the sugars. So let's call it at perfection. So if you just round it off, that would be 130 billion gallons would be possible according to that study. More recently, the same group went back and published just last year an update of this in which they actually put some economic reasoning into the model and which acknowledges that how much biomass is available very much depends on how much you pay for it. So you can see the difference between $50 a ton and $60 a ton at 2017, 2022, and 2030. And furthermore, you can see that now, according to their model, woody crops have gotten a lot bigger. So these are perennial grasses, and these are woody crops, and these are annuals. So at least they envision that the biomass of the future will be coming from perennials, essentially, and that there's a price response. Now, at $100 a ton, you can see that $50 means 50 cents a gallon is the biomass cost for a gallon of cellulosic ethanol, according to that. Okay, so when it comes to what a gallon of ethanol is worth, it's actually not going to be a feedstock problem. That's not where the price is going to be. Okay, I just wanted to throw this in. This is one of our studies on sort of a county-by-county analysis of what different types of biomass cost using a supply and demand function. And the only point I wanted to make was if we just look at corn stover, for example, you can see that it's not a very uniform map. It really depends where you are as to what the price of biomass is. So when we see studies like this, this is highly averaged. It really depends where you're going to take the biomass. And you can also see at this, for example, not surprisingly, the Miscanthus is much cheaper, for example, than corn stover or switchgrass in most places, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, so what are the feedstocks? What do they look like? Well, this is one of our favorites in the south. This is Napier grass, and this is 1 year of growth. It's a perennial. It's about 40 tons growing in Florida. It's very cold sensitive, however, so it won't grow very far north. It's about similar to sugarcane in terms of cold sensitivity. Here's a more cold tolerant one. This is Miscanthus Giganteus. This is now about a 10-year-old plot that's been growing at the University of Illinois for the last 10 years, and every year it's been cut at ground level and all the biomass removed. It yields about 18 tons, dry tons per acre per year. It's never been irrigated, it's never been fertilized, it's never been sprayed with anything, and so it looks pretty sustainable to us, and I'll show you a piece of data in a moment. It's not as productive as Napier grass because it survives under the snow during the winter. It's got live roots that live in the ground under the winter, and each spring, as soon as the soil thaws, it emerges, and it's much more productive than an annual crop, of course, because it doesn't have to be planted. So with something like corn, the farmers have got to wait for the field to get dry enough before they can go out and plant it. And this will start as soon as the soil thaws, actually. So it's our poster child for a good crop. One of the reasons we like it is shown here. It's being harvested here, and you see the snow on the ground in both cases. And this plant undergoes what's called, essentially programmed cell death. So in response to a light periodic cue, it mobilizes mineral nutrients from the plant and stores them back in a perennial root in the ground, a rhizoid. And each season it recycles the mineral nutrients. So when it's being harvested here, the carbon-nitrogen ratio is about 700. So you're not taking very much mineral nutrient off. And for sustainability reasons, that's an important thing. The second thing that's nice about it is because it's taken off-season with all the other crops, let us say corn and soybeans and the other things that are grown in the United States, it actually amortizes both labor and equipment in a period of the year when the farmers don't have competing demands. And so in the context of supporting farming, we think it looks desirable because it will allow a farmer to take some piece of his land, probably the most marginal piece, put this crop on it, and devote his labor and machinery resources to that crop at a different time than the other crops. And we think that will support small farmers, actually. So here's a sustainability study, the longer one. This is a 14-year study, in this case in England. And in this study, they put no nitrogen on it for every year for 14 years, or 60 pounds or 120 pounds. And then they took all the biomass. And what you can see is a striking lack of response to nitrogen fertilizer. It's really remarkable, and it's one of the reasons we like it. And it just reflects the efficiency with which this plant is able to recycle those mineral nutrients. So in the context of sustainability, this is the kind of plant we're interested in. Additionally, these plants, even when we take all the biomass, the best analyses indicate that these plants continue to load carbon below ground. So here's Miscanthus, and you can see these are different time horizons. Now these are projected from models, I have to say, rather than, in this case, these are not direct studies. But you can see for several things. First of all, at every time horizon, it's loading carbon into the ground, even when all the above ground biomass is taken. And our studies of actual measurements of soil carbon over on that and other Miscanthus stands for the last 10 years validate this so far, at least. By contrast, you see corn destroys soil carbon at every horizon. So the tilling of the soil leads to the metabolic oxidation of soil carbon, and it's quite destructive. So we actually, another reason we like this type of crop is that we think it'll feed sustainability. I want to point out that sugarcane is also looks pretty good at everywhere below 20 centimeters. So the top of the soil is not perfect, but deeper in the soil, it looks pretty good. And here's switchgrass down here. Another reason we're attracted to these types of species is shown here. So this is soil erosion, and you can see that for perennial herbaceous like miscanthus and switchgrass, you can't measure erosion because the roots are always alive. They have these big roots. Similarly, wood is pretty good. And so what the importance of this is that I guess everyone will be familiar with the idea there's a lot of sloping land out there. So this actually makes it feasible to use sloping land that's not suitable for these types of crops. So, because obviously these things will wash away. So when we speak about using marginal land to grow these kind of energy crops, sloping land is one of the types of marginal land. In order to figure out where to grow these things, we've been using we and others have been using computer models that take in 100 biophysical parameters and then integrate meteorological data with soil data. And we're able to model where these types of plants will be grown. And this is one of several models done by my colleagues, Fernando Miguez and Steve Long and Herman Bolero. And what you can see is wherever it's reddest is the best region for miscanthus in the United States. It's kind of interesting that actually this region, which is deep in the Corn Belt or the most productive region, is not necessarily the best region for miscanthus because in the eastern half of the state, for example, the soils are too shallow, and so miscanthus, like these perennial grasses, needs a really deep rooting system, and the soils are actually. Whereas corn has a very superficial rooting system. So, so far, this analysis plus our economic analysis that I don't have time to go into indicates that these grasses don't compete at all on the same acres as corn and soybeans. They go for actually quite different types of acres, which is also informative. Now, you may wonder, why what's going on here, but I suppose it's obvious that if one looks at the rain map of the United States, we need a certain amount of water to grow crops, and this is, I think, is the 30-inch line right here. So these crops will only grow sort of east of the Mississippi, or at least without irrigation. And we believe that in the context of sustainability, we have to grow these things without irrigation. And so 35 inches, a meter, I think that's about 2.3 million liters of water per acre, something like that. It's just to give you a sense. So east of the Mississippi, we have more than enough water to grow these very productive species without irrigation. Now, if we look worldwide at how much land or how land is used, this summarizes it very coarsely. You can see we use about 12% of land for food crops directly. The big use is pasture and range, and then there's a very large amount of non-arable land. I think it's interesting, we're trying to understand this use. So as I mentioned, in Brazil, for example, 234 million hectares. Hectare is 2.5 acres. That's a lot of land for pasture and range, and it's a story that's repeated around the world. A lot of the acreage is really used for that. But the interesting thing, for example, about the Brazilian pasture lands is that in a natural ecosystem, they're not very productive because there's so much rain, the soils are actually depleted in potassium and phosphorus. But you can go in and you can one-time fertilize them, and they become the most productive acres on the planet because they have a lot of sunlight and a lot of rain. And so you can grow 100 and 120 tons of sugarcane on an acre of those pasture acres. It's an interesting example or counterexample to a kind of an ecological theory, which is that you can't improve the productivity in an agricultural system over a native vegetation. It's just not true, at least in some places like the Cerrado. So we're very attracted by these acres since there's really a lot of them. And one of the ways of understanding those and other acres that might be available is illustrated in a couple of papers cited here. In brief, some colleagues used both a combination of historical data and satellite imaging to look at how land is used worldwide. And in this study, they concluded that they could find 1.5 billion acres of land that had been farmed and has been abandoned to farming. And similarly, actually, this study done here at Stanford by Chris Field and colleagues found, I can't remember, I think it was about 1.3 billion was their estimate. That's a somewhat surprising number to people, and particularly when you look and you see in the United States, there's quite a bit of land that's been abandoned to agriculture. And in the United States, it's for economic reasons. Land that used to be farmed fell out of production as the really productive acres and improved crops went on the really productive acres. Elsewhere in the world, let us say in India, it can be mostly because of bad land management practices. But the importance of these acres for our purpose is the following, that when land gets converted to agriculture, I'm going to call it the ecosystem costs are paid and the carbon costs are paid. So whatever ecosystem was on there, you destroyed it when you converted it to agriculture. And then all the, whatever carbon was on it, you also destroyed a lot of that. And so these acres now, I think to a large extent, if we could bring them back into production for energy crops, they wouldn't incur either food liabilities or ecosystem liabilities. Now the problem with that is that a lot of those acres, if you match up this is global net primary productivity, meaning how much biomass can you produce? And you can see that wherever it's red, it's too dry for maximal production. Wherever it's blue, it's too cold. And wherever it's green, it's cloudy at least. So water is the limit, the main limitation to global net primary productivity. That's why 1/3 of the Earth's surface is considered non-arable. And so we've got an investment in understanding the role of so-called Crassulacean acid metabolism plants, or CAM plants. And here's 2 examples. This is agave americana, which is very common here in the Bay. And this is agave cisalana, which is grown to make rope in East Africa. And you can see where it's growing. So these will grow on land that has less than 10 inches of rain. You probably know here in the Bay, these agaves will grow without water for April to November. Very drought hardy, remarkably productive in our hands, about 7 dry tons per acre year, even under these extreme conditions. There's about 3 billion acres like this around the world that's currently not used and that we think could be suitable. So we have field trials of this around the world now in these xeric environments to understand. It's a really attractive plant as well. It's 25% sugar by mass and very low lignin content. And so the conversion to fuels is actually easier with these plants than with any of the other ones we're currently working on. Finally, there's quite a bit of urban waste around that's also relevant. I don't want to dwell on it, but I do want to point out, and this is from a study actually that Bert was involved in, the so-called California Energy Futures Study. And the key thing I want to point out is that the use of landfill, as shown here in the dark bars, which is actually pretty prevalent in the United States, there are some regions of the world where they actually don't have landfill at all, which is interesting. And this landfill actually can have a heck of a lot of cellulosic biomass in it. So here's an analysis of California's landfill. And our analysis is there's about 20 million tons of organic waste in there, which would convert at least to 1 billion, if not 2 billion gallons of fuel. So no matter what you think of growing plants for energy, at the very least, there's quite a bit of cellulosic biomass around in our landfills that's going to be suitable for this process. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about the availability of biomass right now. My personal opinion, having worked in the field for some time, is there's a lot of it around. Not necessarily everywhere you want it. I don't think Japan is going to be a really big biofuel kind of operation. On the other hand, in Brazil and the United States, and in East Africa, or in Eastern Europe, Africa as well, there's a lot of biomass around that I think is going to be suitable. And then there's a lot of acres, such as in Australia, those deserts in Australia. We're running field trials down there of agaves, and I think from first principles, we know that it's going to be pretty productive there. Okay, I want to switch now to how you turn this stuff into fuels. Well, let's start here. So this is a piece of a pine board, and in a pine board, as in every piece of plant biomass, all the mass is actually in the walls, the so-called cell walls that surround every cell. And if you look at the cell walls up close, this is what they look like in an electron micrograph. They're primarily composed of cellulose. About half of the mass, 45% of the mass, is cellulose, which is a composite of beta-1,4 linked glucans that are hydrogen bonded together into these sort of what are called microfibrils, and they contain about 36 of these strands. And that's what provides these, it provides the main structural element of the body of plants. There's a second major polysaccharide in this kind of highly idealized version called Hemi Cellulose. And this polymer in red is Hemi Cellulose. It's generally beta-1,4 linked xylose. And it hydrogen bonds to the surface of the cellulose. Cellulose is very sticky. Anybody who's got a piece of paper, you need to bear in mind, paper doesn't have any glue holding it together. That's just the hydrogen bonding of cellulose fibrils holding themselves together. And that's why it falls apart in water. It's like water is displacing the hydrogen bonding. Okay, so xylan can be about 25% of the mass. And then there's one more nasty polymer in there. This is an example of what's called lignin. And it's a polyphenolic, as you can see, made up of 3 units that are linked together in a free radical polymerization process in all possible combinations. And since it's made in a non-enzymatic process, well, that and for some other reasons, there are no enzymes that break this down. And so a lot of soil is actually this material. And of course, coal is this material. Lignite and lignin, they are related. And the lignin, unfortunately, is cross-linked to the hemicellulose, which is then hydrogen bonded to the cellulose. So that's how the whole thing kind of holds together. And the function of lignin, which can be 20, well, let's call it 15 to 25% of the total mass, is to provide what's called compressive resistance to the material. Now, to convert that into this mixture of polysaccharides and lignin, so let us say 95% of the body of a plant is usually that. There are some plants that have a bunch of silica as well, but a typical plant of our interest would be about 95% polysaccharides and lignin. To convert it to a fuel, actually this is the right route right here. We heat it to 1,000 degrees, and at 1,000 degrees it turns into a mixture of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, so-called syngas. And the petroleum industry knows how to convert this to gasoline and diesel and almost everything else you would like, not only by so-called Fischer-Tropsch, but also by something called the mobile process, biomethanol. So this can easily be converted to methanol, which can easily be converted to that. So this runs, Fischer-Tropsch, I think probably runs at every refinery every day. So why don't we do this? Well, the short answer is something like the following, that this process, because it's running at 1,000 degrees and at 22, high pressures, 22 megapascals, it follows, as it turns out, the engineering scale rule, which is probably well known here, but basically the bigger you build it, the lower the unit price of the product. And so the syngas reactors in South Africa, where they really most advanced the technology, are 40 feet across and 200 feet tall, single reactor. It cost $1 billion each. And so to amortize a reactor like that, you need a lot of mass, say 250,000 barrels a day or 10 million gallons a day would be a typical throughput for such a reactor. It's very, very hard. It's impossible, in my acquaintance, to get that much biomass into a central location. So biomass, unfortunately, is distributed over the landscape and has to be kind of gathered towards a central location, unlike coal, which goes point source to point source very efficiently. So far, the logistical challenge of getting enough biomass to one of the locations is what prevents the commercialization of this today. It doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. People are trying to figure out how to scale it down. People are trying to figure out how to condense biomass so that we can ship it to central locations more efficiently. Maybe that will work because we really understand this well. I'm going to skip pyrolysis. So in general, with some minor exceptions, the industry has turned towards a biological conversion because we have several of them working pretty well already. So in this scheme, we have sugarcane. You just squeeze it. You get a sugar syrup. You can ferment it directly, distill it, dry it, and it really works efficiently. In Brazil, I just visited a mill, and they claim all their costs, everything in, is 40 cents a liter to make ethanol. Similarly, making corn ethanol is not very different. The starch, which is alpha-linked glucose, has to be, well, it doesn't have to be. At present, they cook it briefly to hydrate it so that it is susceptible to enzymatic hydrolysis to free glucose. And then actually it ferments almost identically, except about a third of the mass of the corn grain is left in as a kind of the embryo of the corn grain, which is a high protein meal, is left in as a solid and removed at the end of the process to feed to cattle. There is a new enzyme out that doesn't require cooking, but it's not in widespread use yet. That will be a big improvement in the energy efficiency of that process. So these processes really work pretty well, pretty efficiently. And so cellulose is just beta-linked glucose, and you would think, well, what's the big deal? It should go pretty well. But it turns out that converting those microfibrils that I mentioned into free sugars turns out to be quite hard. You can boil it in sulfuric. Well, actually, the way to measure cellulose is to boil it in nitric acid. And that destroys everything else. And what it leaves is cellulose unscathed. And then you can boil it in sulfuric acid, and eventually it'll turn into free sugar. So it's really recalcitrant material. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, we can certainly make this process work. I mean, it's known how to do it, and it can be done at some cost, and that's what I want to really talk about. But first, I wanted to, I've shown this slide so many times, and I think it kind of hypnotizes people into thinking that this is a really easy thing to do, and I probably said it was easy, which is true to some extent, but I thought it would be worth, particularly here in an engineering department, to show an Aspen model of what stuff really looks like. And so that process, the cellulosic process, has been modeled, and it's got 20 schema like this to turn that kind of very simple series of boxes into a real process. So it's a little bit more complicated than just 5 boxes. I guess that's probably widely known here, but well, that model allows this. It's called the NREL model, which was updated, as you can see, in 2011. Is a really very useful model, and what they've modeled is what's called the dilute hot acid hydrolysis. And so what they do is they chip the biomass. They put it in 1% sulfuric acid at 160 degrees for about 2 minutes. So they inject it with a steam gun. And what that does is the hot acid, sulfuric acid, depolymerizes the Hemi Cellulose. And that's then washed out as a dilute acid stream. Then they add enzymes, cellulases, and the cellulases go after the cellulose and eventually break that down into sugars. And then the remaining solid is lignin, and they just dewater that and send it off to a boiler. And so they've got a very good, really well-defined Aspen model for this. And here's how it breaks down as to where the capital costs are. And what caught our attention is shown here. This is what's called the boiler. So when I said they dewater it and send the lignin and send it off to a boiler, you can see that, I don't know, 35% of the total cost is that boiler. And I just want to show you what a boiler is. This is a boiler. It sounds easy, everybody thinks of what you got in your basement, but this one is 6 stories tall, and this is the scale of a 100 million gallon a year refinery. This particular one is at a sugarcane mill in Brazil, but it's state of the art, and that's what we need. So now when you see, yeah, okay, 35% of the total capital cost is the boiler, it kind of makes sense. The second biggest cost, interestingly enough, is the wastewater treatment. And the first time we saw that, we were shaking our head as well. And so, but the way to think about it is that, when you make ethanol, you might get to an 8% solution before, typically you would get to approximately an 8% solution. You might get a little bit higher if you can load enough solids into the fermenter. But then if you think, well, if you have a 100 million gallon a year production schedule, and you're only getting 8% ethanol, that's more than 1 billion gallons of wastewater in a single refinery. And so dealing with that wastewater, which could have several percent of solids left in it, is a big cost. Actually, the other costs don't look so outrageous to us, although there's costs everywhere. So I'm going to come back to it in a minute. There's the boiler. Then there's a bunch of process costs, and I don't have time, unfortunately, I think, to go through these. And so let me just say, we know what the process costs are, and the biggest one is actually the pretreatment and the enzymatic hydrolysis. That's adding about 80 cents a gallon to the costs. You can see up here, they say they estimate the feedstock and handling is only 74 cents. Remember, I was showing $60 even $50 a ton for the raw biomass. So this is after the transportation and loading and everything else. So all these processes work, and these and many other variants of them. And right now, our mission, in a way, is to figure out how to get these things to actually work at a price that can compete directly with petroleum, unsubsidized production of fuel that will compete with petroleum on price. And so when we look at how to do that, we realize we actually have to reduce the capital costs and the operating costs. I mean, they're both twice too high at present, according to our best estimates. And here's a list of some of the things. Minimize the number of unit processes, minimize residence time, etc. Eliminate that solids boiler. I mean, one way of eliminating solids boiler, is just like, well, pellet the lignin and sell it to a coal plant, and just buy your electricity and steam back from a coal plant if you can do it. There's somehow in the field, there's a belief that you have to do it all yourself, which is probably a silly idea. But I want to show you what we think is the opportunity, since my time is limited. At present, every process envisioned in the field that I'm aware of is a batch process. And what that means is, of course, at time zero, you fill some sort of a big reactor with sugar or biomass. Let's keep it simple, sugar. And during the course, and then you throw in a big slug of yeast cells. In Brazil, 1/6 of the reactor volume is yeast cells. It's a pretty big component. And then during the course of the 20 hours or something, the sugar gets used up and the fuel accumulates. And then you have to empty this reactor. And typically these reactors are on the million-liter scale. And so it takes quite a while to pump them down. They have a 6-inch pipe coming out of them, but even at that volume, it's a pretty big process. All the enzyme that you may have added in to depolymerize the sugars is lost. The cells, which can be a huge percentage, are lost. You have the wastewater problem and the solids boiler. There are other problems. Let's just keep it simple for the moment. The main thing is that during this whole process of taking the reactor down and cleaning it up, the capital is unused. And so all your capital costs are sitting unused, basically. That by itself at least doubles the capital cost of the reactor. Not to mention throwing away the catalysts and the cells. And then of course the reactor is there's only one moment in the whole time scheme when it's actually running optimally. The rest of the time it's obviously suboptimal, right? Because the conditions are constantly changing. So we look at this and just think, this is wrong. And I think everybody in the chemical industry knows that from first principles. Like I think essentially all chemical processes run industrially as a continuous process. So we've tried to imagine what a continuous, here's a continuous process, what a continuous process would look like. I just wanted to point out that a continuous process that's really running well looks like that. Nothing is changing, So here's in our dreams what we're actually working towards. So what we would like to do is we'd like to have a concentrated sugar solution that's representative of the sugars in the biomass. We'd have a tank with a fuel-producing organism. We add sugar and we remove fuel, and not water. Well, only enough water to balance what we have to add with the concentrated sugar solution. And we don't throw anything away. So whatever's in the tank stays in the tank. And in fact, so we've actually started towards this. And to make this work, we need a few innovations. One is we need a membrane that will do fuel-water separations. And a colleague at Berkeley, Nitash Balsara, has been working on this for the last 5 years. And we have membranes that more or less meet our criteria for doing the fuel-water separations we want. And I say fuel because, as I'll show you, we're not only interested in alcohol. The second thing we need is we need to be able to use all the sugars simultaneously. So biomass is made of mostly xylose and glucose, but there's some other sugars. And anyway, we need to use them all. We can't have anything accumulating there. And then we need to be able to separate the lignin, obviously, from the sugar, because we can't be adding things that accumulate in the reactor. Oh yeah, and we need to be able to make sure nothing else grows in the reactor. So we need to control the hygiene. So in terms of removing lignin, we've been trying all kinds of things. We had a huge investment in so-called ionic liquids. Here's an example. Because these materials, these are molten salts at near room temperature, and they're very good solvents for a lot of different things, including biomass. You can see here's an atomic force image of a piece of biomass before and after brief treatment with this ionic liquid. And what you can see is it's completely, it's converted this kind of fibrillar material to an amorphous material, which, by the way, is extremely easy to digest. What it doesn't show is that the lignin stayed soluble in the thing. So it gives us a lignin polysaccharide separation. But the key to this is that it takes about $40 worth, even at perfection prices, $40 worth of material to solvate 5 cents worth of biomass. And so to do that, you obviously have to have like 4 nines of recovery. You've got to be able to recover 99.99999% of the material. And we could never get anywhere near that. We couldn't get within 3 orders of magnitude of that amount of recovery of the solvent. So that, unfortunately, was a failure. We killed that. Another approach we've been trying, or we've tried with some success, is we've started looking for catalysts that will depolymerize the various linkages. There's about 21 linkages in lignin, so no single catalyst will do it. And so we've synthesized model compounds containing all the linkages, and then some of the chemists at Berkeley have started looking for affordable catalysts. And this is a recent paper by John Hartwig showing that a very inexpensive nickel catalyst will cleave these ether linkages. We have another vanadium catalyst that also does this. And so this is possible. We might be able to infuse the biomass with catalysts and depolymerize the lignin and kind of wash it out with some acceptable solvent. It's an unsolved problem. I'll come back to how it might be done. Yeah, here it is. Our default is the following, that the Nazis about 70 years ago were interested in this problem as well. The German engineers, I should call them. And they developed a process for depolymerizing wood chips. If you soak wood chips briefly in 42% hydrochloric acid, the polysaccharides depolymerize into free sugars, and the lignin remains polymeric. So you can remove the lignin in a solids separation. And there's a little company called Verdia. It used to be called HCl Cleantech, for those of you who follow the field. They've actually figured out a process for recycling the hydrochloric acid as a dry gas. And so this actually produces a very beautiful stream of sugars. And there's some preliminary evidence that this can be, certainly that the recycling can be done cost effectively. Of course, the challenge here now is that 42% hydrochloric acid is a difficult operating environment. It scares the heck out of us, actually, at scale. If you try to imagine, these are big reactors, a million liters of 42% hydrochloric acid is really scary. I have visions of First World War scenarios, whole towns under clouds of chlorine gas. And so I don't know. It mostly scares the BP engineers. They've gotten used to being appropriately scared by big operations. And so I don't know whether we'll be able to implement this. It turns out polyvinyl chloride is very resistant to hydrochloric acid, and so you can build a lot of the operation from supported polyvinyl chloride. So it's mostly the valves and switches and pumps and things that have to be made of some very resistant alloy. Anyway, this would work. This would meet our criteria, and so we're actually investigating this now as to whether this can really be done. All joking aside, I'm going to skip this because I'm really late in time. Wow, sorry. So I wanted to come back to one of the others. So we haven't solved that lignin problem. We have a potential solution, but we're still working on it. However, the matter of how to use all the sugars, we actually have a solution, and I apologize, it's not the slide I wanted to be showing, but I guess I can tell the story with it. The basic problem we're faced with is right now that the yeast that are used for these fermentations only use glucose. They can be engineered to use xylulose this is a pathway for utilizing xylulose from Pichia stiptis. but it turns out that if they're fed glucose or cellulose, if cellulose is completely depolymerized into glucose, the glucose completely prevents operation of this pathway, and you can see it here actually. So here's an organism that contains this pathway, and at time 0, it's fed both glucose in blue and xylose in green, and first it uses all the glucose, and then it uses the xylose. So that's incompatible with a continuous process, obviously, right? We need to use everything simultaneously. Anyway, to make a long story short, we identified some time ago a transporter that would take up cellobiose. And cellobiose, it turns out, is a disaccharide that's the repeating unit in cellulose. In cellulose, the glucose, because the glucose moieties are flipped, every alternating glucose is flipped, so there's a disaccharide repeating unit. And we actually engineered yeast to use cellobiose and then convert it inside the cell into glucose. And it turns out cellobiose has no inhibition of xylose utilization. So we now get cells that can use both glucose and xylose simultaneously. Here's a real-world example, actually. At time 0, they were fed 40 grams of both cellobiose and xylose, and you can see they use them simultaneously. So we actually think we have that problem solved to our satisfaction as well, at least in one form. So the big remaining problem to go continuous, in our mind at present, is actually the figuring out how to get the lignin and the polysaccharides separated. I only have a couple of minutes left, and I guess that would be the case. And I just want to tell you one last little story. Because I mentioned that we're not necessarily working on ethanol. You know, ethanol is a good fuel, but 60% of fuel demand in Europe is diesel, and in this country, 60 billion gallons of demand is diesel and jet fuel. Ethanol won't work there. So there is something called biodiesel, and this shows, you know, in the major countries, the production where it's made from. In the United States and Brazil, it's soybean oil, and in Europe, it's rapeseed oil. But you can see that it's a pathetic amount, 400 million gallons in the United States. And in fact, the Congressional Research Office did an analysis of how much we could make if we converted all the butter, all the vegetable oil, all the tallow, all the lard, every ounce of fat that we could find in the United States. That would be 3 billion gallons. So that would be 5% of our demand. So biodiesel is not a solution and is not going to be. So what is diesel? Well, here in the shortest possible way is a composition of diesel. So you see it's made up of some normal alkanes, some isoalkanes, cycloalkanes, and some aromatics. And then you can see the chain lengths here. So let's call it normal around 14 or 15 carbons. And there are ways to make such things from biology. Here's sugars. Here's the path to ethanol. Here's the path to alkanes, actually in the 17, 18 carbon range, or terpenes in the 15 to 30 carbon range. So there are biological routes to make these things. But it turns out that these routes are actually energetically expensive. So the mass conversion from sugar to these fatty acid-related compounds is only about 30%. And so in the industry, no one is willing to actually do this because they always say, well, why should I take such a big hit on the mass conversion when I can just make ethanol? And there's a bigger tendency to just see whether we couldn't just splice ethanol up into something more interesting, since it could be made at such high efficiency relative to these compounds. So we've been looking for alternative routes to diesel that have good energy and mass conservation. And just last week, one of my colleagues, Dean Tost, and several chemical engineers, Harvey Blanche and Doug Clark at Berkeley, published a paper in which they revived an ancient process that has worked quite well in the past, so the so-called ABE process. So ABE means acetone, butanol, and ethanol. And these are made in a very fixed ratio by Clostridial species. And in fact, the process for making these ran commercially until 1965. This is the process that Israel was founded on, the Weizmann process. It turns out it went out of production mostly because to produce these molecules, they had to do a separation that was quite expensive. So we started some years ago seeing whether we could do something more interesting with them. And you can see from these conversions that Dean has identified a catalyst that is able to condense these things and dehydrate with the removal of water to make molecules that are very attractive in the diesel range. And these conversions take place under mild conditions at greater than 95% efficiency. So in fact, we're pretty excited about this because the ABE process runs with a very high mass and energy conservation. And these are good molecules, and they're pretty easy to separate. The catalysts that Dean discovered are not water sensitive, so we think we can run them under with kind of simple separations. And actually the membranes that Natash Balsara has developed do the separation, the water fuel separation. So we like it a lot as well because it's what we call a hybrid fuel. You know, one shouldn't think that a biofuel has to be made by a biological process. So this one is partially made by a biological process and partially made by catalysis, and we actually think that's a promising direction. I also just have to say that, you know, it's possible to completely remove the biology from it, or after you've made the sugar. So this is some old work, but still highly relevant and very a dynamic area that we're also into, in which you can dehydrate sugars rather easily to things like hydroxymethylfurfural, and then through aldol condensations build them up and you know, hydrogenation to fuels that are also very good diesel and diesel jet and gasoline substitutes. And we have some innovation in this area as well that looks promising to us. So we do see interesting, and by the way, this of course gives 100% conversion at least of carbon and builds on the rather cheap natural and abundant natural gas that's around now. Whereas this process, by the way, doesn't require any hydrogen input. So we see some other routes to making fuels that will allow us to go directly into the existing infrastructure without having to build somehow a whole an alcohol infrastructure. So that's what I wanted to convey in the available time. I think I have already tried to make these points that I think that, you know, nobody knows how big biomass or biofuels will be, but I can say today that biofuels in the United States are 35 times bigger than all solar in terms of the amount of energy. So they're not some marginal little thing. Worldwide, this year we make enough biofuel to fuel Germany. And I think that's just the tip of the iceberg as to how big it can be. But it's not a solution. I didn't want to convey that. I think personally, you know, if we could get to some time ago, Steve Chu enunciated the idea that we should get 1/3 of our fuel from biomass, and I think that's a fairly reasonable goal. Then I think we should get another 1/3 by energy conservation, and, you know, then we'd be at half or something. I don't think we don't see technical barriers to these conversions, but displacing an entrenched industry that's really operating efficiently is not about whether you can do it or not. It's whether you can do it at perfection. And we still have a ways to go before we're there. And I've tried to give you a sense of where we can go to get closer to perfection. You know, so as I say, going continuous is our big idea. And then I also tried to convey that, well, we can see routes beyond ethanol, and they're a bit more complicated than just fermenting something. We think most of the routes to diesel and gasoline are hybrid routes that involve a bunch of chemistry downstream of the biology. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. And if you go to our website, we've got short summaries of the 70 research programs that are ongoing in my institute, everything from economics to agronomy and chemical engineering and biology. Thank you very much.
Do we have time for some questions?
So in your concluding slide, you said you don't envision too many technical barriers, and then you briefly mentioned you have a potential solution to the lignin problem. So I just want to hear what this solution might be. Maybe you can spend a few minutes on it.
Well, that was the strong acid represents a way to do it. Remember I said if we just put biomass in 42% hydrochloric acid, it actually gives us what we want. And at small scale, that can be run under conditions that look, you know, economically attractive. And right now, the big issue there, I think, is thinking about the safety of really scaling it up to a larger scale. Can it be scaled up without, you know, safely? But we hope there's another solution. It's always going to be dangerous, to have that much strong acid around. Yes?
Very good. A lot of questions. But going back to both the first principles and what you ended up with, saying that we could run all of Germany, or that we do all
already.
Germany on. But thermodynamically, we waste 2/3 of that energy by less. Right? So now, going back to first principles, photosynthesis is only about 7% efficient.
Yeah.
So why do we figure, and this is a psychological problem too, because how flexible are people in your field to say, well, really does it make sense to try to use something that's less than 7% efficient when the solar cells for less than $1 a watt are now 20% efficient?
I hope that we'll be able to, solve our energy needs with solar. I think that's the optimal solution. But right now, to make a meter of Miscanthus or of one of these perennial grasses costs a few pennies. So we have a lot of land. We have a lot of labor out there that makes a living on the land. The system is poised to, well, it's able to produce this material at costs that are comparable to petroleum-based fuels. We think it will eventually be even cheaper than petroleum-based fuels, and it provides a lot of other value in the economy. So I guess that's the short answer. I think the only way that solar will displace biofuel, which, as I said, biofuel is 35 times bigger than solar right now. Solar may displace it, but you're going to have to do it economically. I don't think it'd be a bunch of guys like us sitting around saying, yeah, the correct solution is solar. We know that. I agree 100% with you. But
well, that's why we have the California million solar roofs. Right. That's 3 gigawatts at least.
Actually, Bert and I, and maybe some other people in the room were involved in something called the California Energy Futures Study, where we worked for a couple of years to figure out how California can meet AB 32. And I think one of the interesting results from that was that at the end of the day, we actually needed biofuels because we could not expect to electrify the heavy-duty fleet or the airplanes. And so actually, all the biomass that my colleague could find in California wasn't enough to just meet that. We had to actually import half, again, as much biomass into the state in order to do that. So I don't think we're ever going to be completely released from needing some biofuel. But it's a long ways away. I mean, as Steve Chu says, we're going to run out of atmosphere before we run out of petroleum. And so I think that's what the trade-off is, yeah.
Last question in the center here.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask as a follow-up to that question. Once you factor in the cost of refining the grasses or the sugarcane, and then factor in the inefficiencies of combustion, is it still much cheaper than solar?
Yeah, it's still very, very cheap. So I think I said, for a liter of sugarcane ethanol, all the costs, operating and capital costs, in 49 cents a liter, 39 cents a liter. And our projections are that we can bring cellulosic ethanol down essentially to the price of sugarcane ethanol. So that's pretty efficient, actually.
Very good. I think we should.
Oh, there's one more question. Oh.
Okay, one last question.
Since feedstocks are so distributed in where they can be grown, do you see some of these steady flow production processes being scalable and maybe even distributed and perhaps done on site?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in the idea of scaling it down and distributing it, and then distributing the fuel rather than moving feedstock around. Right now, in theory, these biological processes scale down, but the pretreatment doesn't scale down very well. The fermentation is really, you can do it in a 1 liter flask. It really works well, but so far we've not been able to figure out how to do the so-called pretreatment of the biomaterial to depolymerize the biomass to make it available. So everything is possible, but right now people are generally aiming at 50 to 100 million gallon scale, and that takes about 10% of the land cover from a 25-mile radius, something like that. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.